September 6th, 1976. The morning began like any other at Chugyevka Air Base in the Soviet Far East, where MiG-25 Foxbat interceptors sat ready to defend the USSR's Pacific coastline from American reconnaissance flights. The massive hangar doors opened, revealing the angular, intimidating silhouette of the world's fastest operational fighter jet, a plane that had haunted Western intelligence agencies for nearly a decade. Ground crews performed their routine pre-flight checks on 3 MiG-25s preparing for a training sortie over the Sea of Japan. Among the pilots suiting up that morning was Senior Lieutenant Viktor Belenko, a 29-year-old interceptor pilot who had been planning this day for 2 full years. What his commanding officers, his squadron mates, and even his ground crew didn't know was that Belenko had no intention of returning to Soviet airspace. In his flight suit pocket, hidden beneath layers of Soviet military regulation, was something strictly forbidden: the training manual for the MiG-25 Foxbat. In less than 3 hours, that manual, along with the aircraft itself, would be in the hands of American intelligence, and Viktor Belenko would become one of the most valuable defectors in Cold War history. The boy from the Urals. Viktor Ivanovich Belenko was born on February 15, 1947, in a small village in the Ural Mountains region of the Soviet Union. His early life unfolded against the backdrop of post-World War II reconstruction, in a country still reeling from the devastating loss of over 27 million Soviet citizens during the Great Patriotic War. The Soviet Union of Belenko's childhood was a place of contradictions, triumphant in its victory over Nazi Germany, yet struggling with shortages, bureaucratic inefficiency, and the iron grip of Stalinist authoritarianism that persisted even after Stalin's death in 1953. For young Viktor, like millions of other Soviet boys, the path to upward mobility and a better life lay through military service. The Soviet military offered education, prestige, and relative comfort compared to the grinding poverty of collective farm life or factory work in the industrial heartland. From an early age, Belenko showed an aptitude for mathematics and technical subjects, qualities that would later serve him well in the cockpit of one of the most complex aircraft ever built. The Soviet education system, despite its ideological rigidity, excelled at identifying and cultivating technical talent, particularly in fields related to military and aerospace applications. Young Viktor absorbed the standard Soviet propaganda about the superiority of the communist system, the inevitability of socialism's global triumph, and the existential threat posed by American imperialism. Yet even then, beneath the surface of official ideology, questions began to form in his mind. Questions about why, if the Soviet system was so superior, did ordinary citizens live in such difficult conditions while party officials enjoyed luxuries unavailable to the masses? In his teenage years, Belenko set his sights on becoming a pilot. The prestige associated with aviation in the Soviet Union cannot be overstated. Pilots were celebrated as heroes of Soviet labor, modern-day knights defending the socialist motherland from capitalist aggression. The competition to enter military flight schools was fierce, with only the most physically fit, politically reliable, and academically capable candidates accepted. Belenko passed the rigorous entrance examinations and psychological evaluations, demonstrating not only the technical aptitude required, but also the ideological conformity expected of Soviet military officers. His acceptance into flight training marked the beginning of a career that would take him to the controls of the Soviet Union's most advanced interceptor. The making of a Foxbat pilot. Flight training in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, the PVO Strany, a separate branch from the Soviet Air Force, was notoriously demanding. The PVO was responsible for defending Soviet airspace from intrusion, particularly from American reconnaissance aircraft that regularly tested Soviet air defenses along the borders. This was not a glamorous posting flying ground attack missions or engaging in dogfights. This was the cold, methodical work of intercepting high-altitude, high-speed targets before they could penetrate deep into Soviet territory. The training regimen reflected this mission, emphasizing instrument flying, high-speed intercepts, and the operation of complex radar and weapon systems. Belenko proved to be a capable and dedicated student pilot. He mastered the basics on trainer aircraft before graduating to operational jets, learning not just how to fly, but how to think like an interceptor pilot, calculating intercept courses, managing fuel in high-speed pursuits, and making split-second decisions at altitudes where a single mistake could be fatal. His performance earned him assignment to one of the PVO's most elite units, those equipped with a MiG-25 Foxbat. This posting was both a testament to his skill and a reflection of the trust the Soviet system placed in him. After all, the MiG-25 represented one of the Soviet Union's most closely guarded military secrets. The McCoy-Engravich MiG-25, NATO reporting name Foxbat, first flew in 1964 and entered operational service in 1970. It was designed for a specific purpose: to intercept American B-70 Valkyrie bombers, which were expected to penetrate Soviet airspace at Mach 3 in altitudes above 70,000 feet. Though the B-70 program was ultimately canceled, the MiG-25 remained in production as an interceptor capable of reaching speeds exceeding Mach 2.8, making it one of the fastest operational aircraft in the world. Western intelligence agencies were terrified of the Foxbat. Satellite imagery revealed an aircraft with enormous wings and powerful engines, leading analysts to conclude it must be an incredibly agile fighter that could dominate any aerial engagement. NATO planners worried that the MiG-25 represented a technological leap that had given the Soviets air superiority. The reality, which Belenko would soon reveal to the West, was more complex. The MiG-25 was indeed fast, but achieved that speed through brute force rather than elegance. The aircraft was constructed primarily of nickel steel rather than titanium or advanced composites, making it extremely heavy. Its engines were powerful but crude, and its avionics, while sophisticated by Soviet standards, lagged behind Western technology. The Foxbat could reach incredible speeds in a straight line, but it was not the super-maneuverable fighter Western analysts feared. It was a specialized interceptor built to do one thing exceptionally well: race to altitude, launch its missiles at incoming bombers, and return to base. For Belenko, learning to fly the MiG-25 was both exhilarating and sobering. The aircraft was a beast, difficult to handle, unforgiving of mistakes, and capable of killing an inexperienced pilot in an instant. The acceleration was brutal, the controls heavy, and the cockpit cramped and uncomfortable. Yet there was also a certain pride in mastering such a demanding machine. Belenko became proficient in high-altitude intercepts, learning to coax maximum performance from the temperamental aircraft while managing its limitations. He flew patrols along the Soviet Far East Coast, occasionally scrambling to intercept American reconnaissance aircraft that probed Soviet airspace. These were tense encounters, the Cold War made manifest in the narrow airspace between two rival superpowers. Disillusionment sets in, but as Belenko accumulated flight hours and experience, his view of the Soviet system began to change. The glamour of being a MiG-25 pilot could not mask the harsh realities of life at Chugyevka Air Base. The facilities were abysmal: decrepit barracks with inadequate heating, poor food, and chronic shortages of basic supplies. The officers' quarters were little better than those provided to conscript soldiers. Maintenance equipment was outdated and often broken, forcing ground crews to improvise repairs with whatever materials they could scavenge. Morale among the pilots and ground personnel was low, a toxic combination of harsh living conditions, bureaucratic incompetence, and the knowledge that party officials lived in relative luxury, while those defending the motherland suffered. Belenko attempted to address these issues through official channels. He filed complaints with his superiors, detailing the problems and suggesting solutions. The response was dismissive, even mocking. This was simply how things were, and a junior officer questioning the system was viewed with suspicion rather than appreciation. The experience was a turning point for Belenko. He began to see the Soviet system not as the workers' paradise described in propaganda, but as a rigid, corrupt hierarchy where competence mattered less than party connections, and where the welfare of ordinary citizens and soldiers was sacrificed to maintain the privileges of the elite. Belenko's personal life was also unraveling. He was married to Ludmila Petrovna, and they had a son, Dmitry, born in January 1973. But Ludmila came from a wealthy family and had grown tired of life as a military wife. The constant relocations, the poor living conditions, the long separations when Belenko was on duty, all of it wore on their marriage. By 1976, the relationship had deteriorated to the point where Ludmila told Viktor she was filing for divorce and planned to move with their son back to her parents' home in Magadan. For Belenko, this was devastating. He loved his son and faced the prospect of losing him to a system that would likely prevent any meaningful contact if Ludmila moved hundreds of miles away. The combination of professional disillusionment and personal crisis pushed Belenko toward a decision that would change his life forever. He had heard stories of defectors, Soviet citizens who had fled to the West and found freedom and opportunity there. The official line was that these were traitors manipulated by Western intelligence services who inevitably regretted their decisions and lived miserable lives as outcasts. But Belenko had begun to question everything the Soviet system told him. If the propaganda about living conditions, about the superiority of socialism, about the happiness of the Soviet people was false, perhaps the stories about defectors were false too. What if life in the West was actually better? What if there was a place where competence was rewarded, where citizens had real freedom, where he could build a new life on his own terms? Planning the escape. The decision to defect is never made lightly. For a Soviet military officer, particularly one with access to highly classified information and equipment, defection meant abandoning everything: family, friends, homeland, identity. It meant becoming a traitor in the eyes of the state he had sworn to defend. The KGB had long reach, and defectors who made themselves too visible sometimes met untimely ends. There was also no guarantee of success. The border guards shot people trying to escape, and a failed defection attempt would result in execution or decades in the Gulag. Yet Belenko found himself increasingly convinced that remaining in the Soviet Union meant a life of frustration, mediocrity, and slow spiritual death. He began planning in earnest, a process that would take 2 years of careful preparation. The first challenge was geographic. Belenko was stationed in the Soviet Far East, thousands of miles from the nearest Western country. Defecting to China was not an option. Relations between the USSR and the People's Republic had been hostile since the Sino-Soviet split. That left Japan, the nearest non-communist country, approximately 400 miles across the Sea of Japan. The distance was achievable in a MiG-25, but timing and execution would be critical. Belenko knew he needed to be stationed at a base close enough to Japan to make the flight feasible. He actively sought and received a posting to the Sokolovka Air Base near Vladivostok, positioning himself within striking distance of his destination. This was a risky move. Requesting a posting to a border region could arouse suspicion. But Belenko framed it as a desire for a more prestigious assignment, and his request was approved. Once at Sokolovka, he familiarized himself with flight patterns, radar coverage, and the protocols for routine training sorties. The MiG-25's fuel capacity presented another challenge. Soviet authorities, well aware of the defection risk, implemented strict protocols to ensure aircraft were not fueled beyond what was necessary for their assigned missions. A pilot on a routine training flight would receive just enough fuel to complete the sortie with a small reserve, not enough to reach Japan. Belenko would need to convince his ground crew to give him a full load of fuel without arousing suspicion. This required building trust and rapport with the maintenance personnel, establishing a reputation as a demanding but fair pilot who knew his aircraft and insisted on proper preparation. When the day came, he would need them to trust his judgment about fuel requirements without questioning his motives. Belenko also needed a cover story in case the defection failed. If he was intercepted and forced to return, or if Japanese authorities refused to grant him asylum and sent him back to the Soviets, He would need an explanation that might save his life. He devised an elaborate tale about navigational equipment failure, claiming that malfunctioning instruments had caused him to fly into Japanese airspace by mistake and that he had been forced to land due to low fuel. It was a thin story, unlikely to withstand serious scrutiny, but it was better than nothing. The final piece of preparation was psychological. Belenko had to steel himself for what he was about to do, betray his country, abandon his son, and risk everything on the hope that the Americans would grant him asylum. He thought about Dmitri constantly, the son he might never see again. The pain of that loss was nearly unbearable, but Belenko convinced himself that staying would mean condemning both himself and, eventually, his son to live trapped in a failing system. Perhaps one day, if the political situation changed, he might see Dmitri again. It was a fragile hope, but it was enough to keep him moving forward with his plan. The day of decision, September 6, 1976, arrived with clear skies over the Soviet Far East. Belenko was scheduled for a routine training sortie with 2 other MiG-25 pilots. The mission profile was standard: fly out over the Sea of Japan, practice intercept maneuvers, and return to base. This was the opportunity Belenko had been waiting for, a legitimate reason to be airborne with enough fuel to reach Japan. The night before, he had carefully reviewed his plan, memorizing the route, calculating fuel consumption, and visualizing every step of the flight. He slept poorly, his mind racing with possibilities and fears. That morning, as he suited up in the pilot's ready room, Belenko maintained a facade of normalcy. He joked with his fellow pilots, went through the standard pre-flight briefing, and gave no indication that this would be his last day as a Soviet officer. In his flight suit pocket, hidden carefully, was the MiG-25 training manual, a document classified at the highest level, possession of which outside authorized circumstances was a serious crime. Taking it was a calculated risk, but Belenko knew the manual would significantly increase his value to American intelligence and improve his chances of being granted asylum. At the aircraft, Belenko performed his walk-around inspection with extra care. The MiG-25 looked formidable on the ramp, its massive twin engines and angular fuselage suggesting raw power barely contained. He checked the control surfaces, examined the tires, and verified that external weapons had not been loaded. He did not want to arrive in Japan with armed missiles, which might provoke a hostile response. Then came the critical moment, fueling. Belenko informed the ground crew that he wanted a full fuel load, citing the possibility of extended maneuvers during the training flight. The crew chief hesitated, but Belenko was known as a thorough pilot, and his explanation seemed reasonable. The fuel truck arrived and topped off the MiG-25's tanks, enough to reach Japan with fuel to spare. Belenko climbed into the cockpit, settled into the ejection seat, and began the startup sequence. The twin Tamansky R-15 engines roared to life, their distinctive howl echoing across the airfield. He ran through the checklist methodically, ensuring all systems were functioning properly. Radio check, flight controls, instruments, weapons systems disabled, everything was ready. Ground control cleared the 3 MiG-25s for takeoff, and Belenko taxied into position. His heart pounded in his chest, but his hands were steady on the controls. There was no turning back now. The 3 Foxbats roared down the runway in sequence and lifted off, climbing rapidly into the morning sky. They formed up in a loose tactical formation and headed east toward the Sea of Japan, their contrails tracing white lines across the blue expanse. For the first 20 minutes, Belenko flew normally, maintaining formation and following the flight plan. He needed to wait until they were far enough from base that pursuit would be difficult, but not so far that his wingmen would notice his deviation immediately. The break for freedom. Then, without warning, Belenko broke formation. He rolled the MiG-25 hard to the right and pushed the nose down, diving toward the sea below. His wingmen, caught completely off guard, initially thought he was performing an unannounced maneuver. Within seconds, they realized something was wrong and gave chase, calling frantically over the radio for Belenko to return to formation. But Belenko had already switched his radio to emergency frequencies and ignored their calls. He descended rapidly toward the wave tops, leveling off at approximately 100 feet above the water. This was the most dangerous phase of the flight. At this altitude, a momentary lapse in concentration would send the MiG-25 plowing into the sea at hundreds of miles per hour. The massive interceptor was never designed for low-altitude flight. Its weight and momentum made even small corrections difficult. But flying this low was essential. It would keep him below Soviet radar coverage for as long as possible, delaying detection and pursuit. Behind him, Belenko's wingmen followed as far as they dared. But as he crossed into Japanese airspace, they broke off. Soviet pilots were under strict orders not to violate foreign airspace without explicit authorization. The consequences of an international incident could be severe, and the wingmen had no way of knowing whether Belenko was defecting or experiencing a genuine emergency. They turned back towards Soviet territory, reporting the incident to their controllers and triggering alarms throughout the Soviet air defense network. Belenko pressed on, the MiG-25 skimming across the gray expanse of the Sea of Japan. The flight seemed to last an eternity, though in reality it was less than an hour. He monitored his fuel gauge obsessively, calculating and recalculating whether he would have enough to reach Japan. The low-altitude flight consumed fuel at an alarming rate, and there was no margin for error. If he ran out of fuel over the water, his only option would be ejection, and survival in the cold sea was far from guaranteed. As the Japanese coastline came into view, Belenko pulled the MiG-25 into a climb, ascending rapidly to 20,000 feet. This was a calculated risk. Climbing made him visible to Japanese radar, but also ensured that Japanese air defense would detect him and not shoot him down as an unidentified intruder. The thick cloud cover over Hokkaido complicated matters, reducing visibility and making navigation difficult. Belenko had studied maps of the region and had planned to land at Chitose Air Base, a major Japanese self-defense forces installation. But in the clouds and confusion, he could not locate Chitose. Japanese radar operators had indeed detected the unidentified aircraft, and F-4 Phantom fighters were scrambled to intercept. But the weather and the limitations of the F-4's radar systems worked against them. The Phantoms, relatively new to Japanese service, had poor look-down, shoot-down radar capability and could not locate Belenko's MiG-25 in the clutter of clouds and ground returns. The Japanese ground controllers tried to hail the unidentified aircraft on radio, but Belenko's radio was tuned to different frequencies and he could not hear their calls. He was on his own, descending through the clouds, fuel running critically low, searching desperately for a place to land. Landing at Hakodate. Through a break in the clouds, Belenko spotted a runway. Hakodate Airport, a civilian facility on the southern tip of Hokkaido. It was not the military base he had hoped for, but his fuel situation left no room for further searching. He configured the MiG-25 for landing, extending flaps and landing gear, and lined up for final approach. The massive interceptor, never intended for precision landings at short civilian runways, descended toward the pavement. The landing was rough. Belenko touched down hard, the MiG-25's tires smoking as they grabbed the runway. He applied maximum braking, but the aircraft's momentum was enormous. The MiG-25 rolled far down the runway, finally coming to a stop uncomfortably close to the departure end. Belenko shut down the engines, the turbines winding down with a descending whine. For a moment, he sat in the cockpit, his hands shaking, the reality of what he had just done crashing over him like a wave. He had done it. He was in Japan, outside Soviet territory, beyond the reach of the KGB. But he was not safe yet. Airport workers and security personnel rushed toward the aircraft, shocked to see a Soviet military jet sitting on their runway. Belenko slid back the cockpit canopy and stood up in the seat. He was wearing his service pistol, a Makarov PM, standard issue for Soviet pilots. According to some accounts, he fired the pistol into the air, ostensibly to keep the Japanese workers at a distance while he assessed the situation. Other accounts suggest he simply displayed the weapon as he exited the aircraft. Either way, the presence of the gun would later become a minor diplomatic issue. As Japanese security personnel cautiously approached, Belenko made his intentions clear in broken English and through gestures. He wanted political asylum in the United States. The airport officials, utterly unprepared for such an event, immediately contacted Japanese authorities. Within hours, the incident had escalated to the highest levels of the Japanese government and triggered urgent communications with the American embassy in Tokyo. Diplomatic crisis. At the Tokyo Lawn Tennis Club, Nicholas Platt, a young American diplomat serving in the political section of the U.S. Embassy, was enjoying a Sunday tennis match when he was urgently paged. As the embassy's duty officer and the official responsible for handling defector cases, Platt was told to return immediately. A Soviet pilot had landed a MiG-25 in Japan and was requesting asylum in the United States. Platt immediately recognized the significance. The MiG-25 was one of the most feared aircraft in the Soviet arsenal, and the opportunity to examine it would be an intelligence windfall. He drafted an immediate cable to the State Department requesting approval to grant Belenko defector status and arrange his transfer to American custody. The response from Washington was swift and positive. George Bush, then Director of Central Intelligence, would later describe the opportunity as an intelligence bonanza. The CIA had been trying to obtain detailed information about the MiG-25 for years, and now one had literally fallen into their laps, complete with a pilot willing to explain its capabilities and limitations. The State Department authorized Platt to proceed with arranging Belenko's transfer. But there was a complication. The Japanese government was deathly frightened of the Soviets and wanted to avoid a major diplomatic confrontation. Japanese officials initially suggested returning both the pilot and the aircraft to the Soviet Union immediately. The Ministry of Justice even claimed jurisdiction over Belenko's case, arguing that he had violated Japan's National Sword and Gun Act by waving his pistol on Japanese soil. This was clearly a pretext. The Japanese government was looking for any excuse to minimize the diplomatic fallout with their powerful neighbor. The Soviet response was predictably furious. Soviet officials initially claimed that Belenko had simply lost his way due to navigational errors. When that explanation was rejected, they suggested Belenko had been drugged by Japanese agents after landing. The Soviet embassy demanded the immediate return of both the pilot and the aircraft. When that demand was refused, Soviet diplomats arranged a meeting with Belenko, hoping to convince him to return voluntarily. On September 9th, 3 days after the landing, a Soviet embassy representative met with Belenko under Japanese supervision. The Soviet official tried every argument, appealing to Belenko's patriotism, reminding him of his family, warning him of the difficulties he would face as an exile in a foreign culture. The conversation was tense and emotional, but Belenko's resolve held firm. He refused to return to the Soviet Union. The Soviet representative left the meeting empty-handed, and Soviet anger intensified. Examining the Foxbat. While diplomats argued over Belenko's fate, American and Japanese intelligence officials were far more interested in the MiG-25 sitting at Hakodate Airport. Initially, the Japanese government authorized only limited examination, ground tests of the radar and engines, external measurements, and photography. But American negotiators pressed for more, and eventually the Japanese agreed to allow a complete disassembly and examination of the aircraft. This was an extraordinary concession and reflected both the strategic importance of the intelligence opportunity and American diplomatic leverage. On September 25th, the MiG-25 was loaded onto a U.S. Air Force C-5 Galaxy cargo aircraft and flown to Hakodate Air Base, a Japanese facility where the detailed examination could be conducted more securely. Teams of American and Japanese engineers, intelligence analysts, and aerospace experts descended on the aircraft. Over the following weeks, the MiG-25 was systematically disassembled, every component examined, measured, photographed, and analyzed. What they discovered was both reassuring and revealing. The MiG-25 was indeed capable of extraordinary speed and altitude performance, but achieved this through brute force rather than technological sophistication. The airframe was constructed primarily of nickel steel, chosen because it could withstand the extreme temperatures generated by sustained high-speed flight. Titanium, the material used in American high-performance aircraft like the State Route 71, was in short supply in the Soviet Union, and steel was the pragmatic alternative. But steel was heavy, and the MiG-25's weight severely limited its maneuverability. Western fears of a super-agile fighter that could dominate any dogfight were unfounded. The MiG-25 was a specialized interceptor, fast in a straight line, but unable to turn quickly or engage in close-range combat effectively. The engines were similarly revealing. The twin Tamansky R-15 turbojets produced enormous thrust, but they were primitive by Western standards, with relatively low efficiency and high fuel consumption. The avionics, while sophisticated enough to perform the interceptor mission, used vacuum tube technology in many systems, a choice driven by the Soviet electronics industry's lag in solid-state components, but also by concerns about the vulnerability of transistors to the electromagnetic pulse from nuclear detonations. The radar system was powerful but lacked the sophistication and resolution of comparable Western systems. Perhaps most importantly, the examination revealed that the MiG-25 was not a multi-role fighter that could threaten American air superiority in a conventional conflict. It was an interceptor designed to race to altitude, fire long-range missiles at incoming bombers, and return to base. Against fighters, particularly in a turning engagement, the MiG-25 would be at a severe disadvantage. This intelligence was enormously valuable for NATO planners, allowing them to adjust their assessments of Soviet air power and develop appropriate countermeasures. Belenko himself provided crucial context for the technical findings. He explained operational procedures, training methods, tactics, and the strategic doctrine behind the MiG-25's employment. He described the aircraft's limitations, the heavy controls, the restricted maneuvering envelope at high speeds, the fuel consumption that limited patrol time. He also provided insights into the broader Soviet air defense system, including radar coverage, command and control procedures, and the integration of interceptors with ground-based missile systems. This human intelligence complemented the technical examination perfectly, giving Western analysts a complete picture of both the aircraft and the system in which it operated. The return of the Foxbat. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, continued to demand a return of the MiG-25. Soviet officials sent Japan a bill for $10 million for damage to the aircraft, an absurd claim given that Belenko had landed intact. The Japanese government responded with its own bill, $40,000 for damage to Hakodate Airport's runway and for the cost of shipping the aircraft back to the Soviet Union. Neither bill was ever paid, but the exchange reflected the diplomatic tensions surrounding the incident. By October 2, 1976, American and Japanese experts had completed their examination. The Japanese government announced that the MiG-25 would be returned to the Soviet Union, but it would be shipped in crates rather than flown. This was a deliberate decision. Shipping the disassembled aircraft would take weeks, giving Western analysts additional time to review their findings and ensuring the Soviets understood that every component had been thoroughly examined. The aircraft was moved from Hyakuri Air Base to the port of Hitachi on a convoy of trucks and trailers on November 11, 1976, a procession that attracted significant media attention. The Soviets initially demanded to inspect the crates before accepting the aircraft and even requested permission to fly one of their Antonov and 22 heavy transport aircraft to Japan to carry the MiG-25 home. The Japanese government refused both requests. The Soviets had no choice but to accept the Japanese terms. On November 15, 1976, 30 crates containing the disassembled MiG-25 were loaded aboard the Soviet cargo ship Tygonos at Hitachi port. The ship departed for Vladivostok, arriving approximately 3 days later. When Soviet technicians opened the crates, they discovered that several components were missing, whether deliberately withheld for further study or simply misplaced during the disassembly process remains unclear. New life in America. While the MiG-25 was being returned in pieces, Viktor Belenko had already begun his new life. On September 9, 1976, just 3 days after his dramatic landing, Belenko was escorted onto a Northwest Orient Airlines commercial flight from Japan to the United States. For security reasons, the details of his exact destination were kept secret, but he was taken into the care of the CIA for extensive debriefing. The debriefing process was lengthy and thorough. American intelligence officers questioned Belenko about every aspect of his life, career, and knowledge. They wanted to understand not just the technical details of the MiG-25, but also the organizational structure of the Soviet air defense forces, training methods, command relationships, morale, living conditions, and the broader political and social environment in the Soviet military. Belenko proved to be an extraordinarily valuable source. Unlike some defectors who provide limited information or who have been away from sensitive positions for years, Belenko was a current operational pilot with recent experience in one of the Soviet Union's most advanced weapons systems. He was granted political asylum and, eventually, American citizenship. The U.S. government provided him with a new identity, financial support, and assistance in building a new life. Belenko settled into his new country, studying English intensively and working to adapt to a radically different culture. The transition was not easy. He had left behind his son, his extended family, and everything familiar. The guilt over abandoning Dmitry never fully left him, a wound that would never completely heal. But Belenko gradually built a successful career in his adopted country. He became an aerospace engineer, working as a consultant for American defense contractors and sharing his expertise on Soviet aviation technology. His insights were valuable not just for understanding the MiG-25, but for analyzing Soviet design philosophy, manufacturing capabilities, and strategic thinking. He also became a public speaker, giving lectures on his experiences and on the nature of the Soviet system. His story became a powerful piece of Cold War propaganda, a real-life defector who had chosen freedom over tyranny. Belenko also ventured into business, demonstrating the entrepreneurial spirit that had been suppressed under Soviet socialism. He found success in his various endeavors, achieving a level of personal and financial freedom that would have been impossible in the Soviet Union. For all the personal costs of his defection, Belenko never publicly expressed regret about his decision. Consequences and aftermath. The defection of Viktor Belenko had far-reaching consequences for all parties involved. For the Soviet Union, it was an intelligence disaster and a propaganda embarrassment. Not only had they lost one of their most advanced aircraft to the Americans, but the defection highlighted the disillusionment and poor morale within Soviet military ranks. The fact that a trusted officer, a pilot with access to highly classified systems, had chosen to flee to the West undermined Soviet claims about the superiority of the socialist system. Soviet authorities conducted extensive investigations to determine how Belenko had managed to defect and who might have been complicit. Security protocols were tightened, particularly regarding fuel loads and monitoring of border region flights. Belenko's former commanding officers faced severe consequences for failing to prevent the defection. The KGB intensified its surveillance of military personnel, particularly those in sensitive positions, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that further damaged morale. The Soviet Union also engaged in retaliation against Japan for its handling of the incident. Japanese fishing vessels operating near Soviet waters were seized, and their crews were imprisoned under dubious legal pretexts. This was widely interpreted as punishment for Japan's refusal to immediately return Belenko and the MiG-25. Soviet-Japanese relations, never warm during the Cold War, deteriorated further. For Japan, the incident exposed serious vulnerabilities in its air defense system. Belenko had penetrated Japanese airspace, flown for an extended period undetected or unintercepted, and landed at a civilian airport without being challenged. The inability of Japanese radar to adequately track his aircraft and the failure of F-4 fighters to intercept him revealed gaps in Japan's defensive capabilities. These shortcomings were embarrassing for the Japanese self-defense forces and prompted a comprehensive review and upgrade of air defense systems. For the United States, Belenko's defection was an unqualified intelligence success. The examination of the MiG-25 provided invaluable technical intelligence that informed American aircraft design, tactical development, and strategic planning for years. Understanding the Foxbat's true capabilities allowed the U.S. to more accurately assess Soviet air power and allocate resources appropriately. Belenko's debriefings provided insights into Soviet military culture and operational procedures that complemented technical intelligence from other sources. The propaganda value of a Soviet pilot choosing freedom was also significant, reinforcing the narrative of the Cold War as a struggle between liberty and oppression. The defection also had an impact on popular culture. Clint Eastwood's 1982 film Firefox, about an American pilot who steals a Soviet superfighter, was directly inspired by the Belenko incident. While the film was fictional and heavily dramatized, the basic premise, a Soviet pilot defecting with an advanced aircraft, resonated with audiences precisely because a similar event had actually occurred. Return to Russia. In 1995, nearly 2 decades after his defection, Viktor Belenko made a surprising decision. He returned to visit Moscow. The Soviet Union had collapsed in 1991, and Russia was now a very different country from the one he had fled. The trip was carefully planned, with assurances from Russian authorities that he would not face prosecution. Belenko's motivations for returning are not fully documented, but likely included a desire to see his homeland again, to visit family members if possible, and perhaps to gain some measure of closure on the life he had left behind. The visit was reportedly emotional and complex. Belenko saw a Russia struggling with the transition from communism to capitalism, a country facing economic hardship, political instability, and an uncertain future. The communist system he had despised was gone, but what had replaced it was chaotic and difficult. Whether he was able to reconnect with his son Dmitry during this visit is not publicly known. Such personal details were likely kept private. What is clear is that Belenko returned to the United States after his visit, his life and identity firmly rooted in his adopted country. The trip to Russia seems to have been more about confronting the past than about any desire to reclaim it. Death and legacy. Viktor Belenko died on September 24, 2023, at the age of 76. He had lived 47 years in the United States, nearly twice as long as he had spent in the Soviet Union. His death received relatively little public attention. The Cold War had long since ended, and the dramatic defections and espionage cases that once captivated the world had faded into history. But within the aerospace and intelligence communities, Belenko's passing was noted with respect. He had been one of the most significant defectors of the Cold War era, a man whose decision to flee had provided the West with crucial intelligence at a critical moment in the superpower confrontation. Belenko's legacy is multifaceted. On a technical level, his defection with the MiG-25 provided the United States with detailed knowledge of Soviet aerospace technology and design philosophy. This intelligence informed American aircraft development and helped shape NATO's strategy for countering Soviet air power. The revelation that the MiG-25 was not the superfighter Western analysts had feared allowed for a more realistic assessment of the military balance and potentially prevented wasteful spending on countermeasures to an exaggerated threat. On a human level, Belenko's story illustrates the profound personal costs of defection. He gained freedom and opportunity, but he lost his son, his homeland, and his identity. The decision to defect is often portrayed in simplistic terms, choosing freedom over tyranny, liberty over oppression. But for the individual making that choice, it is far more complex, involving the sacrifice of family, culture, and all the intangible connections that make up a life. Belenko lived with that sacrifice for nearly half a century. His story also serves as a reminder of the human dimensions of the Cold War. The superpower confrontation was not just about missiles, alliances, and ideological competition. It was about individual people making impossible choices in the face of systems that constrained their freedom and crushed their spirits. Belenko was one man, one pilot, who decided that his personal freedom and dignity were worth more than his position, his nationality, or even his family. Whether that decision was brave or tragic, right or wrong, is not for history to judge. It was his decision, made in the crucible of a life lived under a repressive system, and he lived with the consequences of that choice for the rest of his life. Conclusion. On September 6, 1976, Viktor Belenko took off from a Soviet airbase in a routine training flight and landed in Japan as one of the most valuable defectors in Cold War history. His decision to steal the Soviet Union's most secretive fighter jet and fly it to the West was an act of extraordinary courage, calculated planning, and deep personal conviction. The intelligence windfall from examining the MiG-25 was significant, but perhaps the more enduring legacy is what Belenko's story reveals about the human cost of totalitarian systems and the price of freedom. Belenko lived long enough to see the Soviet Union collapse, to return to a transformed Russia, and to build a successful life in America. But he never escaped the shadow of that September morning when he broke formation, dived toward the sea, and flew toward an uncertain future. His story remains one of the most dramatic episodes of the Cold War, a testament to the power of individual choice even in the face of overwhelming state power. Viktor Ivanovich Belenko, the pilot who stole the Soviet Union's most secret fighter jet, lived a life defined by that single, irreversible decision. It brought him freedom, but it cost him everything else. Whether the trade was worth it, only he could truly say.